everybody, today we're going to talk about climate, what it is and what it's not. And one way to think of what it is and what it's not is to compare it with something that you're familiar with, which is weather. So let's talk about climate versus weather. Weather is something that happens on a day-to-day basis. Climate is something that happens over a very long period of time in a place. Climate is the average weather, the average rainfall, the average temperature of a place over a very long period of time. On the other hand, weather is the average temperature and rainfall of a place in a very short period of time. The way to think of climate is what you expect, and weather is what you get. Day to day, over a very long period of time. Climate over a long period of time, weather day to day. Okay, there are two ways that climate can vary. One way, it can be either moderate or extreme. An example of an extreme climate here is the polar climate. Climate that is very far from the equator. It has a very long, cold winter and a very short, rather cool summer. A moderate climate such as ours has relatively mild winters and relatively mild summers. And another difference between these two climates, or the way climates vary, is that extreme climates, like the polar climate, like the climate near the equator, has just 2 seasons, whereas our climate, a moderate climate, has 4 seasons. Again, thinking about weather, this is something that we're all familiar with. We're all familiar with the daily forecast. What should we expect tomorrow? Is it going to rain? Do I need to bring my umbrella? Or what's going to happen for the weekend? I got some outdoor activities planned. You're going to worry about the weather. You're not really worried about the climate. And another way of thinking about weather is that sometimes events happen on a day-to-day basis that is not really part and consistent with the climate that we are in. For example, remember the big ice storm we had a few years back and how they completely shut down traffic in the Atlanta area? Well, that was kind of a freak event and something that was kind of outside the norm, outside the usual type of climate that we expect. But it was what we got, so that was the weather that we got. Okay, there are 3 factors that affect climate. Latitude. Latitude's effect on climate is simply how close or how far from the equator a place is located. So any place that's located at or near the equator is by definition going to be very hot and either very rainy or very dry, but certainly very hot. As you get away from the equator, it gets to be cooler and cooler to the extreme at the South Pole and the North Pole, where it's very cold. You're very far from the equator. The second factor that affects climate is altitude. Simply how high up a place is. The higher up you go, the colder the climate's going to be. And then finally, the third factor that affects climate, ocean currents. Either warm or cold currents of ocean water that flow from one part of the globe to another and also affects regions' climates. Okay, starting with latitude. Again, as we stated, latitude's effect on climate basically just means how close or how far you are from the equator. Example is the Brazilian tropical rainforest in South America, the Congo rainforest in Central Africa, and the Indonesian rainforest in Indonesia. All 3 of these rainforests are located at or near the equator. Very hot most of the year and very humid because it's right near the equator. The other extreme, the furthest distance from the equator, the 2 poles, the North Pole and the South Pole. As you see, extreme climate, very far from the equator, very cold winters, very long winters, and little or no summers at all. And here in the perfect Goldilocks zone where we are, the mid-latitudes, it's a moderate climate and has 4 seasons: spring, summer, fall, and winter. The extreme climates have just 2 seasons: the tropics and the Arctics. Another factor, as we discussed, that affects climate is altitude. Simply stated, how high up a place is. The further up you go, the colder the air gets. Here is a picture of Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa. Same basic area, same spot, more or less, but at the base of the mountain, very hot, and this happens to be rather dry, but very hot. But as you go up in elevation, the air gets colder and colder to where approximately about 19,000 feet, you have actual snow that stays on the mountain year-round, even though at the base of the mountain, it's extremely warm. Another effect that altitude has is the fact that mountains can block the flow of either warm or cold air. And what that will do is affect the temperature and the amount of rainfall on the other side of the mountain range. So this side of the mountain range where the wind is blowing and the mountains are blocking is warm and rainy, but on the other side of the mountain range there's no rain and it's much cooler than on this side of the mountain. That's another effect that altitude has on climate. And then finally, the last effect that we would like to mention in terms of effect on climate is ocean currents. And what we're talking about here is simply warm ocean water flowing into a place that's cold based on its latitude. So you have ocean water that's warmed by the equator and flowing up to the continent of Europe. So Europe, consequently, because of this Gulf Stream ocean current, ends up being much warmer and much rainier than it would otherwise be, because it is rather far from the equator. If you're this far from the equator, you would expect that Europe would be much colder than it is. And that is because of the ocean current effect on its climate, bringing warm, moist air from the equator up to the continent of Europe. On the other hand, you have a cold ocean current. Here's an example of a cold ocean current, the California current that flows down the west coast of the United States. Consequently, a place like Los Angeles, which is very warm, but if you've ever been to LA in the summertime and gone to the beautiful beaches, you're very surprised and shocked, I must say, to find out how cold the water is. And that is simply because of the cold ocean current that flows on the west coast of the United States. Okay, review. Again, 3 factors that affect climate include latitude, how close or how far a location or a place is from the equator; altitude, how high a place is. The higher up you go, the colder the temperature becomes, the colder the average temperature is. And then finally, ocean currents. Is the place that you live affected by the effect of ocean currents, either warm or cold ocean water flowing by the place that you live on the planet?